Welcome back, everyone. So for this session, we're going back for our third stopping point in the historic avant-gardes, and we're going to talk about Dada in Paris. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to give you just a general overview of Dada, which was far bigger than Paris, especially sort of its ideological underpinnings. That'll be important to know. And then I'm going to give you some examples of their participatory engagements with the public, which you're going to see is distinct from Futurism in some ways, but also compatible, and maybe a little more distinct from the Russian avant-garde. So I think one of the big takeaways for this session, especially when we get together on Zoom and talk, is to try to parse out the way these three movements are similar, are different, and what they tell us about artistic engagement with the public, and actually trying to get the public involved. So without further ado, let's talk about Dada. So if you've never studied Dada before, one of the first things you need to realize about Dada is that it was very international. So whereas Futurism was nationalistic, Dada was inherently against any forms of nationalism, especially patriotism, and we'll talk about that in a moment. So it was an international movement. It begins in Zurich. We'll talk about that in a moment, very briefly. But there were Dada hubs in New York, in Berlin, in Cologne, in Hamburg, and of course in Paris. So you had a pretty great international network of artists, and because of the war, which is a very important backdrop for Dada, as it was for the Futurists, although in a different way. It's the war that led to a lot of movement and migration of these artists from their home countries. So keep that as a geopolitical backdrop. If there was a unifying strategy to Dada, if there was something that sort of tied them together, it was this fervent dislike of nationalism and this fervent dislike of war. So World War I, the backdrop, which is 1914 to 1918, this is one of the things that really fuels Dada, not only physically, like where they end up, but also it's the fuel to their fire, to their artistic fire. So in this way, even if we're going to see some similarities at the level of strategy, especially with the public and public reaction, Dada is diametrically opposed to Futurism. Futurism, you'll remember, used the crowd in such a way that they wanted to engender violence that would be bellicose, that would be this sort of cleansing energy from warlike sentiment. And they were, you'll remember, they were committed to Italian. They would become committed to Italian fascism, and they're committed to Italy as a war power, and they embrace the war as this cleansing event in history. Dada is completely against the war. They're the total opposite of this. And so Dada, instead of trying to harness the energies of the crowd to create this fight club kind of warmongering sort of aesthetic and mood, Dada instead was completely irreverent. They used parody and they used mockery. They were transgressive against the war, and also the class of people that they deemed to be most responsible for the war. So this would not only be the military class, and of course political leaders, but they would see the bourgeoisie, the very bourgeoisie that the Russian avant-garde and the October Revolution was revolting against. They're going to see the bourgeoisie as complicit with the war, and with the nation, and complicit with the destruction that they're seeing all around them in World War I. So we'll talk about this more in a moment. So one of the things they used is parody, is mockery, and so Dada has often been associated with being completely absurd and nihilistic. One of the great quotes, you'll see this in paintings, you'll see this throughout manifestos and that sort of thing. Dada is anti-Dada. So this completely flies in the face of the law of non-contradiction in logic. How can something be Dada and anti-Dada all at once? It defies reason. But that's very much the point. So they embraced absurdity, they embraced the irrational, and they were often for those reasons deemed to be nihilistic. And by nihilism, usually what people mean is having no beliefs, just being completely irreverent and not being committed to anything. At least that's one version of nihilism. There is a way in which we can talk about Dada, and we can interpret Dada actually as through this irrationality, through this embrace of the absurd, that this actually may open up into a philosophy in its own right, that they did have an ideological commitment, that they weren't completely nihilistic. And one of the ways that I try to show this when I teach Dada is to go a little forward to right after World War II, which is going to be even more destructive, more horrifying, and really represents a crack and a break in the history of humankind, especially because of the Holocaust and 6 million people being liquidated in a genocide. So World War II is an utter catastrophe, in the same way that for Dada, World War I was an utter catastrophe. So you have these two philosophers, very, very famous, Theodor Adorno and Max Horkheimer, German philosophers who are known as, in some ways, the founders, along with Walter Benjamin, of the Frankfurt School of Critical Thought. And they read a book called Dialectic of Entitlement, and it's a very difficult book. It's rewarding, it's a very important book, but it's a very difficult book. And it starts with these lines. It starts with this line: in the most general sense of progressive thought, the Enlightenment has always aimed at liberating men from fear and establishing their sovereignty. Yet the fully enlightened earth radiates disaster triumphant. So these are very, very dramatic opening lines to this book. And in class, when we have discussion, I often try to get students to put these very famous first lines of this book into their own words. And a lot comes out of it. And the way I put it in my own words, in everyday words, is that first sentence, they're basically giving you a nutshell historical description of the Enlightenment, a cultural, intellectual movement that begins, and political, that begins in the 17th and 18th century. And the central core of the Enlightenment is for people to be liberated from ignorance, to be liberated from superstition, and to be liberated from dogma, and to understand that they have autonomy, that they're individuals, and they have certain rights. So the history of the rights of humankind come out of this history of enlightenment, in at least in the West, right? And it's all tied up with histories of not only rights, but also science, the histories of technology, and understanding how things work. So the very beginnings of like Newtonian physics and that sort of thing, like understanding what the world really is, right? So science has been a great tool to demystify the world, to get rid of myths, some myths that are destructive, and superstitions, right? So this is what they're saying with that first sentence. Like, this is how the Enlightenment has often been thought, that this liberated us. This allowed us to create all these incredible things, technology, industrial revolution, progress in science, progress in all sorts of different things, right? And of course, who's going to knock the development of rights, the idea that all men are created equal? And just the way our founding documents have it in this country, you notice they use the word men, right? So there's already a problem there. But this is often thought to be a noble and great history, right? And yet, look at that second line. They say, "Yet the fully enlightened earth radiates disaster triumphant." So what do they mean by that? Adorno and Horkheimer are some of the first thinkers that we would describe as counter-enlightenment or anti-enlightenment, or at least they were trying to show that the Enlightenment wasn't all happiness and progress, and sovereignty and liberation, right? There's something about the Enlightenment that also led to catastrophe. This is the core argument of this book. And at first you might think, well, that doesn't really make sense. But if I show you a few images, these are some incredibly consequential human practices that come out of scientific breakthroughs and come out of technological innovation and our ability to harness the power of the earth and of our own technologies, right? These are things that come right out of the history of the Enlightenment for Adorno and Horkheimer. So the GIF here that you're seeing, clearly this is the atomic bomb or the hydrogen bomb, where for the first time man could create something through his or her own reason and technology that would in fact annihilate the whole planet. Or maybe not the planet, but all of life as we know it on the planet, right? So this is really consequential. This is a pretty clear-cut example of science and progress not necessarily leading to the benefit of mankind, or how we would say now, humankind, right? And not only humankind, non-humankind too. This would destroy more than humans, right? And speaking of non-humans, what you're seeing here, this is a large cattle feedlot in Texas by a contemporary artist. This shows you one of the most destructive industrial practices that we have going on today, large-scale animal agriculture. So this is responsible for species extinction. This is responsible for biodiversity loss. This is responsible for deforestation, especially in the Amazon, and this is responsible for the emission of greenhouse gases, especially methane, which is a powerful greenhouse gas. And it's really only the second. Industrial animal agriculture is the second driver of global warming behind fossil fuels. And so here you're seeing the burning of fossil fuels, which is the first and major source of greenhouse gas and the driver of global warming. So like the hydrogen bomb, large-scale animal agriculture and fossil fuel industries, these are man-made, human-made practices and technologies and organizations of nature that are that's leading to our own destruction. Right, that's leading to right before our eyes. We're seeing California burning up. We're seeing Oregon burning up. We're seeing Greenland melt, and our planetary future is very much in doubt because of global warming, which is largely anthropogenic. It's largely driven by humankind, and so Adorno and Horkheimer would not have been surprised by these developments. Right? They would not have been surprised that science, technology, and our ability to harness the energy of nature and subordinate nature, animals, and fossil fuels, and so on and so forth, is backfiring and is leading to some serious problems, existential and climate crises. And here we have a photograph from the Vietnam War. And so this is another example of our ability to make these incredible things. Like we can fly faster than the speed of sound. We have nanotechnologies. We have all these things. We have satellites up in orbit. Right? These are incredible things, and yet they have been used as killing machines, as war machines. Right. So Adorno and Horkheimer's point is that science, technology doesn't always lead to liberating innovation. It can also lead to death and destruction, right? So I've given you a quick primer on this kind of counter-enlightenment thinking, which is very important. I think you probably realize why it's so important to know about these things, and then hopefully start to organize our lives in a way that might help sort of put a damper around these destructive forces. But of course, it's only through a collective political will that we're gonna solve these things. So I think you can all feel that we're in the midst of this right now, especially come November, which is going to be very consequential. And so take all those ideas and think that Adorno and Horkheimer, their disposition towards reason, towards progress, towards innovation and technology, Dada had these ideas in incipient form as artists. This is one of the reasons why they're such an interesting movement, and it's also why they're not necessarily just purely nihilistic and absurd. There was a reason for their madness. There was a reason for their embracing absurdity, because think about it. World War I is happening. And all these things I've described to you, reason, technology, science, and then all the classes that benefit from these things, from the history of the Enlightenment, which would be largely male, of course, totally European and white, and bourgeois and elite classes, right? And the military classes and the political classes, right? So Dada saw them as the enemy. They saw the butchery of World War I at the feet of these classes and at the feet of these ideas. They were one of the first to say, look at what Enlightenment has brought us. It's brought us war. It's brought us millions dead. And it's total madness, right? So it's as if they're saying that reason can go overboard and become mad and destructive and catastrophic. And so then it makes sense that they would get together as a group of artists who were all very different from each other. And you'll notice from the reading that there would always be splinterings. There would always be factions. But in Zurich in 1917, they would get together in Switzerland. Zurich is not coincidental. Zurich was in Switzerland, which was neutral during the war. So this was a way to escape the war. Funny enough, I think I told you this in the Russian Revolution lecture, but Lenin had to escape Russia briefly, and he lived just down the street from where the Dadaists were mucking things up. And so they were in Zurich, and here already we get to some participatory, socially engaged themes, because they didn't go and then start painting in isolation or making sculptures in isolation or what have you. They set up the Cabaret of Voltaire, which was in a cafe, and it's still there. They kind of made it this meeting place where the public could come, a little bit like, just like a soiree of intellectuals and artists and so on and so forth. And they would drink, they would recite poetry, they would recite manifestos, they would show work, and it was just this carnivalesque sort of atmosphere, all based on types of work that would embrace chance, that would embrace absurdity, that would embrace contradiction, that would embrace being completely irrational and irreverent. And so now you see why, if they embrace all these things, it wasn't just to be silly and nihilistic. They were doing it to do the opposite of reason, of technology, of bourgeois seriousness that they saw as responsible for the war, right? So now you see, if you see someone like Marcel Janko in his mask, they would wear masks, they would have these incredible nights where they would drink. I'm sure there was drugs involved, like opium and that sort of stuff, and they would have a wild time. Or someone like Hugo Boss, who was by and large a poet, but he was one of the heads, along with Tristan Tzara, of Zurich Dada. There he is, dressed up as in his magical bishop costume, and he's reciting his poem, Karawane, which is a poem of completely made-up words. So you can't get further away from reason and sort of like like seriousness of the tradition of bourgeois poetry or what have you, than to write poems and poetry that's just pure nonsense, pure sounds, right? So this gives you an idea of what Dada was like. And already in Zurich, they were engaging the public by basically setting up a Dada cabaret, like a cafe, the Cabaret Voltaire. Then we get to our class, and what Bishop is preoccupied with in this part of the chapter of the historical avant-garde precedents. We get to Dada in Paris. So the war ends in 1918, and some of the artists that were part of Zurich Dada would end up going. Some go to New York, some go to Berlin, and then some, like Tristan Tzara, go to Paris. And he, along with Breton, who's probably our big figure for today, because he's talked about quite a bit in this chapter. But it wasn't only him. People like Aragon, Apollinaire, again Tristan Tzara, and Picabia, who's a real treat. Picabia is kind of amazing. They would get together, and they continued on with this tradition of of irreverence and parody, and embracing absurdity, but in Paris, and in a way that was a little more organized than Zurich. So they had soirees, but not so much in cafes, although they would have things in cafes. They would have things in theater halls, right? So they would have these Dada festivals, these evenings with Dada. So here's a flyer for one of the most famous ones. This was at the Salle Gaveau. And you see, it sort of gives you everything that you're gonna have during their soiree. And what's amazing about Dada is that they would sometimes advertise things that they wouldn't follow through on. The most notorious one was when they said that Charlie Chaplin would show up, and it didn't get more famous and big as Charlie Chaplin at that time. He was already a really huge, important filmmaker. So you can imagine how disappointed the public was when Chaplin does not show up. So they would do these sort of things. They would recite poetry that wouldn't really make any sense. There would be music. Often the music would be based just on chance, like someone sitting on a piano and just randomly playing some notes, right? Sometimes they would just recite the news or political manifestos. They would do all sorts of things. And this was one of them. So this is the Salle Gaveau that happened on May 26, 1920. So here you see there's Breton, there's Tristan Tzara, I think this is Aragon, and I can't read the rest, but they're dressed up in these amazing tall hats. They're reciting poetry. Again, there would be music. And at this point, by May 26, 1920, already the audience was a little bit in the know. So before this, this wasn't the first Dada festival. In the earliest Dada festivals, the crowd was really perplexed, and they even seemed bored. And there's an interesting way in which Dada tried to use boredom in these spectacles as a counter spectacle. That's interesting to talk about. This is a very different context from Italian Futurism, who were trying to harness war, and certainly different from the mass spectacles of the Bolsheviks, who were trying to harness collective energy, like serious political energies towards a collective future. Right? Here we're in Paris, the city of lights, and the city where commodity culture and the spectacle and consumerism really is already taking hold in the early 1920s. And so there's something kind of radical and subversive about a group of artists getting up there and just being boring the audience, which is very different from the state of excitation that we're always in, even more so today, in consumer culture, in commodity visual culture, where everything is about lulling you into pleasure, into buying things, into not really thinking that deeply, and all these things that we know are not so great about Western cultures that are based on liberal consumerism, right? There are all sorts of dead ends there. And so it's interesting. Dada is already trying to bore people, or mystify them, or make them think by presenting them with something that's not easy. And so this is really interesting. It's something hopefully we'll talk about when we get together. But by the time we get to the Salle Gaveau and the public manifestations after that, the audience, the Parisian audiences, many of whom are these upper class bourgeois, they know, and then they start to get in on it, and they start to yell, they start to throw things, and it starts to become quite similar to those futurist serratas, where the public would get involved, and you had violent confrontations between the artists and the crowd, and the crowd itself would become part of the work. Right? This is one of the important precedents for participatory practices. But whereas the futurists found this to be a success, because they're trying to harness this energy, and they loved it if the crowd got triggered and violent. For Dada, maybe not so much. And in fact, if you read Artificial Hells that Breton writes, it's his retrospective take on the Dada events before he found surrealism. He's aware of the fact that once the audience, once the public is expecting shock and enjoys shock, then shock as an aesthetic tactic doesn't work anymore. That it's over, right? That it simply is something that's going to be folded into and co-opted by bourgeois society and by the spectacle itself, right? So this is a very important idea that runs throughout the 20th century when it comes to avant-garde practices that try to jolt and try to discomfort the public. If this jolting and discomfort simply becomes a form of entertainment, well, it's over, right? It's not doing anything anymore, right? So Breton's really prescient about this. Like it's pretty amazing that he realized this as early as the early 1920s. And there were some other things that the Dadaists did. Let's go through them somewhat more quickly here, so that we don't go too far over in this video. But whereas most of these Dada festivals and instigations in theaters happened in, these were upper crust, bourgeois, upper middle class places. There were a couple moments where they attempted to engage the working class, les ouvriers. And one of these was at l'Université Populaire de Faubourg Saint-Antoine in February 1920, where they actually went out and tried to explain Dada to workers, right? And here I come back to, if you'll remember that play that Eisenstein puts on, that was written by Tretyakov at the gasworks, right? Where the workers there, the play was about the workers, but the workers were just like, what are you guys doing here? Like, this is just, you're just getting in the way, right? It was a similar thing here. It was very hard for Dada to explain how it would be in some ways useful as a strategy of resistance for this working class who are probably just trying to get by. And they're not interested in these crazy artists, right? So there's a misconnect there, a miscommunication, and then we wonder how much Dada can actually get politically involved, right? How can a movement that's so irreverent and parodic and embraces absurdity, how can it in some ways align with the working class politics? This is a serious problem, and something Breton will also realize, which he'll try to address when he founds surrealism, which will be much more engaged with, let's say, the working class plight, excuse me, and the Communist Party. So this is a telling moment here where they're trying to engage the working class, and it didn't work so well. But there were other strategies that were socially engaged and if not downright participatory. And one would be a call in the Littérature, which was the journal arm of Dada at the time in Paris. So there was a call for an anonymous mural, a public mural, and they it's almost like a Craigslist ad or something like that today, where they would see people deface posters or create murals like today's graffiti artists, right? Who are anonymous, right? We don't know who these people are. So who is this person? In the subway, I used to like looking at ads where people had torn and then made like funny, through the tearings of the posters, like usually movie posters, they would sort of make funny juxtapositions where they would write things, right? This is exactly what they were doing here. They saw, who is the anonymous individual who keeps writing no on posters? Who's the person who keeps signing posters with this name? Or in the bathroom. I'm sure you've all been in a public bathroom, in a coffee shop or something like that, and then there's plenty to read on the walls. Often, not the highest level writing, but sometimes it can be funny. Or the artist who draws on toothpaste ads, right? So they saw these anonymous people doing things in the city, and then they said, let's get these people together and remain anonymous, but make this sort of collective work as a poster. So that's definitely a type of socially engaged, if not participatory work. And another thing that Breton brings here is just conceiving the city almost like as a theater. Which is a breakdown of artist and audience in some ways, right? Or the space of the theater as the place where the artwork happens, and then the public and the city where it's just incidental or outside the space of creation. Breton had a practice of wandering in the streets, almost as a work of art, where he would be attentive to people, to places. And if you've ever been to Paris, Paris is probably one of the best cities just to wander and get lost in. It's very beautiful, and there are all sorts of different places to see. So simply wandering and using the city as almost like a theatrical place to just look at and to make observations. This is something that was important for Breton, and it's a precursor of the Situation International and their technique of the dérive, which we're going to talk about in the coming weeks. So that's another interesting example of this is really not participatory technically, but it is certainly is socially engaged to conceive of the city as a work of art that you can walk through and make some observations. And he immortalizes some of these walks in his famous books, so especially Nadja, where you get passages in that book where he's walking around Paris and telling you about it and telling you about the people he's seen. The works that are far more, let's say, within the scope of participatory art would be the excursions that were planned, but there was really only one, which was the excursion to Saint-Julien-le-Pauvre, a not really well-known Gothic church in a not really well-known or frequented part of Paris. And it was sort of meant to be like a how do you put it, like a sort of like a parodic a parody of the tour guide. So imagine going on a tour guide where the person takes you to like this really unimportant place in Paris, and you're wondering, why are we not at the Tour Eiffel? Why aren't we at Notre Dame? Why are we not at Sacré-Cœur? Like why aren't we at like all the big touristic sites? Why are we here, right? And it's very Dada, right? And here he actually includes the public. Like the public, think of this work almost like as a tour guide. And there are famous photographs. Here's Breton reading something he'd prepared about this excursion, and this is the public. Unfortunately, it was like a dreary, rainy day, so not everything they had planned actually happened. But it's an interesting mode of public engagement, and certainly participatory, since these artists took the public with them, right? So I won't talk too much more about this one, because this is going to be one of the works, one of the events that are going to be presented on in our Zoom session, as will this one. And I won't talk about this one really at all, because this is along with the excursion to Saint-Julien-le-Pauvre, the mock trial of Maurice Barré on May 13th, 1921, is a key event in this participatory work. So I won't really say much about it because we're gonna go through it in depth when we get together in our meeting this week. So I'll just leave you with this image, and I look forward to the presenters getting into the nitty-gritty of what this was all about. It really sort of concludes the Dada season for that year, and really maybe is the end event of Dada in Paris. And so just one takeaway as we end, and we'll open up to some discussion, is to think about artificial hells. This text that Breton wrote, which incidentally I put on the website for the presenters, but if anybody else wants to read it, it's not that long, and it's a nice primary document to read. And I think I signposted this at the beginning of this lecture. One of the major points that he makes in this is he's really worried. He says, what if shock no longer shocks? What if this is no longer a strategy? What if this transgressive, parodic, nihilistic engagement with the public just turns into entertainment value, and it's just shocking for shock's sake, right? This is what he meant by artificial hells, incidentally. Artificial hell, I think you can think of it. I mean, you might have your own take, because he's obviously, Breton's a writer and somewhat poetic. But by artificial hell, I think you can kind of say these are just artificial shocks. Like, people aren't really in hell. This is artificial. This is not really transgressive or constructive through destruction, which is what Dada would in some ways be committed to, right? So already in this text he's pushing back, and it's almost a eulogy for Paris Dada. So this comes from the Witkowski essay Dada Breton, which is good. This is what he meant by artificial hells, in which the public becomes inured to shock. Inured means like you've seen it so much that it no longer really affects you, right? That's what inurement means. Becomes inured to shock and is energized by rudeness, vulgarity, and provocation, and develops a taste for shouting back, egging performers, and further outrageous activities, right? So this would be ideal for the futurists. This is what the futurists wanted. But for Breton, he sees that this is a dead end. And this is just going to become another spectacle in Paris, and Dada will simply become a fashionable trend. And something risky that the bourgeoisie can partake in, and so it'll lose it's lost its edge. And so one of the things I'll leave you with is again, I think for this class the important thing is to understand the differences and to compare the way in which the futurists used the public with the way the Russian avant-garde used the public during the October Revolution and afterwards, and the way that Dada used the public in Paris. Each one has three distinct political ideologies. Each one has a distinct geopolitical setting, which conditions their participatory strategies. So this is one of the things we'll want to talk about, and that hopefully you can sort of address and try to work through with patience and rigor in the comment section. If this is part of the discussion that would be interesting to you, understanding why these three are the three important precedents that's offered up to us in Bishop's book. Okay, see you all next time. That's enough for this for Dada Paris. Take care.